It was one of those warm, forgiving afternoons that made St. Mary Mead appear almost unreal in its gentleness. The air shimmered faintly above the churchyard wall, and bees droned lazily among the lilacs bordering the vicarage garden. It was, as Mrs. Bantry said, the perfect day for the annual garden fete, an event as traditional as the vicar's sermon and just as full of unspoken rivalries. Tables had been set up along the lawn, one for preserves and jams, manned by Mrs. Price Ridley, who never failed to point out which ones were made without shop sugar, one for raffles and flowers, and another for second-hand books, where Miss Marple herself sat, arranging small piles with the quiet precision of someone who noticed everything and said very little. She wore her usual straw hat and gloves, her blue eyes as mild and forgetful-looking as ever. Only those who truly knew her, few dared say they did, understood that behind that gentle expression worked a mind that rarely missed a pattern. The village gathered in cheerful disarray, Colonel Melchett laughing too loudly, Mrs. Hartnell boasting of her daughter's new fiancé, and young Leonard Clement trying to escape his mother's insistence that he mingle with people of standing. It was all very ordinary, very English, and delightfully dull. Until the raffle bell rang. It was Mrs. Langtry who screamed first, an unrefined, gasping sound that startled the doves from the rectory roof. People turned, confused, as she pointed a trembling finger toward the oak tree by the tea stand. There, half hidden behind the bunting, lay the body of a man. Face down, one arm stretched out as if reaching for something just beyond his grasp. "Good heavens," murmured Mrs. Bantry, clutching Miss Marple's arm. "Is that—" Miss Marple had already risen, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Yes," she said softly. "That's Mr. Edwin Carter. How very unexpected." Within minutes, chaos reigned. Colonel Melchett barked orders for the area to be cleared. Mrs. Price Ridley fainted elegantly near the jam table. A policeman fetched from the village station took statements no one could quite remember giving. Amid it all, Miss Marple stood quietly, observing. She noticed the overturned teacup near the man's hand, the missing button from his jacket, and the peculiar way his left shoe was untied. Later, when Dr. Haydock arrived to examine the body, he confirmed what Miss Marple already suspected. Mr. Carter was quite dead, and not from natural causes. But what made Miss Marple pause, long after the crowd had dispersed, was not the manner of his death. It was the object found in his jacket pocket, a folded letter, yellowed and fragile, addressed in delicate handwriting. "To my first love, Edwin, forgive me." Miss Marple turned the letter over thoughtfully, her expression unreadable. For the first time that afternoon, she looked toward the distant churchyard, where the ivy had begun to creep over the stones. "First love," she murmured, almost to herself. "Now that is a dangerous thing to keep secret in St. Mary Mead." By the following morning, St. Mary Mead was already humming with the kind of quiet hysteria that only tragedy could breed. Curtains twitched. The postman lingered longer than usual at each gate. In Mrs. Hartnell's shop, two women whispered so furiously over the price of sugar that they forgot entirely what they had come in for. The death of Mr. Edwin Carter had become, within 12 hours, the most sensational event since the vicar's wife had once misplaced the communion silver. At her cottage on the lane behind the church, Miss Marple sat at her small breakfast table, stirring her tea absently. The newspaper lay folded beside her untouched scone. Her mind was elsewhere. On that letter, the delicate cursive, the phrase, "To my first love." It had struck her then, as it did now, that sentiment was far more dangerous than malice when it came to murder. People, in her experience, killed not out of hatred, but out of something far more tender and misplaced. Outside, the sound of approaching footsteps interrupted her thoughts. A gentle knock followed. "Come in," Miss Marple called, her tone mild. Inspector Craden stepped in, tall and neat, his hat held respectfully in one hand. He was new to the district, young, serious, and altogether too confident. "Good morning, Miss Marple. Thought you might be able to help me sort through what's what." "How very flattering," she said pleasantly, motioning for him to sit. "I can't promise anything of value, Inspector. I merely observe." "Yes, so I've heard," he replied with a faint smile. "About yesterday, you were close to the scene. Did you notice anything unusual?" Miss Marple poured a second cup of tea, handing it to him with quiet precision. "Unusual?" she repeated. "Well, yes, death at a garden fete is rather unusual by itself, wouldn't you say?" He chuckled despite himself. "Besides that," she paused, the cup by his hand. It wasn't from the tea tent, it was from Mrs. Langtry's private set, the fine porcelain ones with the little blue roses. Odd thing, that. She's very particular about them. Craden frowned, making a note. "You're certain?" "Oh, quite. One can always tell Mrs. Langtry's china. It rattles faintly when you lift it, poor dear. She insists on using the cracked ones for fear someone might chip the good set." The inspector nodded slowly. "And the letter?" Miss Marple's eyes lingered on her teacup. "I gather you've read it." "I have. It was old, but not so old that the ink had faded. No signature, though." "That's what makes it interesting," she said softly. "Most people forget to leave out their name only when they believe the recipient will know it already." Craden looked at her curiously. "You think someone from the village wrote it?" "I think," Miss Marple said, her voice lowering, "that love seldom travels far from home." There was a pause. Outside, the postman's whistle drifted faintly through the morning air. Craden cleared his throat. "Carter was staying at the Swan, wasn't he? Been there about 3 weeks." "Yes. Returned recently from abroad, so I'm told. Something about business in Rhodesia, though I can't imagine what business could have brought him back to St. Mary Mead after 20 years. The inspector's pencil hovered. "You knew him before?" "Only by reputation," she said. "A charming man in his youth and not without admirers. Mrs. Langtry among them, I believe, and perhaps Mrs. Bantry once upon a time, though she'd never admit it now." Craden raised an eyebrow. "Old romances, then." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "The village has more of those than graves, Inspector." When he left, she stood by the window watching him walk down the lane, his figure framed by the rising mist. The air smelled of lilac and damp earth. She thought again of the letter, how neatly it had been folded, how deliberately it had been placed in his pocket. Someone had wanted it found. Later that day, as the sun sank behind the hedgerows, Miss Marple took her customary walk toward the churchyard. She liked the quiet there, the sense that nothing could be hidden from time. Passing by the old yew tree, she noticed someone kneeling by a grave, Mrs. Langtry, her broad shoulders shaking faintly. Miss Marple hesitated, then approached with her usual delicacy. "A sad day, Mrs. Langtry," she said gently. The woman turned, her eyes red-rimmed, voice trembling. "He didn't deserve it, Miss Marple. Not like that. We all make mistakes, but he didn't deserve that." Miss Marple studied her face, pale and drawn, before replying softly, "No one ever does, dear. But mistakes, I find, have a curious way of demanding payment." Mrs. Langtry looked away, lips pressed tight. "You think I don't know that?" she muttered, almost to herself. Miss Marple said nothing more. She merely watched as the woman hurried off toward the lane, her shawl fluttering behind her like a shadow that refused to let go. As the evening bells began to toll, Miss Marple turned her gaze back to the graves. Her eyes rested on one name, Edward Langtry, beloved husband, 1898-1924. The corners of her mouth tightened slightly. She murmured, almost wistfully, "First love, last regret. How very often they share the same grave." And with that quiet thought, she began the slow walk home, knowing full well that St. Mary Mead's whispers had only just begun. The following morning brought with it a gentle drizzle that blurred the outlines of the cottages and made the whole of St. Mary Mead seem wrapped in a hush. Even the sparrows on the church roof seemed subdued. In Miss Marple's parlour, the air smelled faintly of lavender polish and rain. She sat by the fire, knitting with absent precision, her thoughts circling quietly around the same troubling points. Mr. Edwin Carter had returned to the village after 2 decades abroad. He had been seen speaking with Mrs. Langtry not once but several times in the week before his death. There had been whispers about an old attachment, perhaps even an engagement that had gone awry. And then there was that letter. It wasn't only sentimental, it was confessional. "Forgive me." 2 words that rarely followed anything innocent. The knock on her door was brisk this time. She rose, smoothing her skirt, and opened it to find Mrs. Bantry standing there, clutching her umbrella like a sword. Her cheeks were flushed from both weather and excitement. "My dear Miss Marple, you won't believe what's being said at the post office. They're saying poor Edwin was poisoned. Poisoned, if you please, at a garden fete. Imagine such a thing happening among decent people." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I find decency a most flexible notion, my dear. Do come in before you catch your death." Mrs. Bantry bustled inside, leaving small wet footprints on the rug. "Of course, Colonel Melchett is in a state. Says the cup was tested. Some residue of cyanide, or so the doctor claims. How dreadful. But really, one wonders, how could anyone have slipped it into his tea in all that commotion?" Miss Marple resumed her seat, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "One doesn't slip such a thing by accident, and one certainly doesn't choose cyanide unless the sentiment behind it is rather personal." Mrs. Bantry stared, scandalized. "You mean to say someone close to him?" "I mean to say," Miss Marple replied softly, "that it was not a crime of opportunity. Whoever did it wanted him silenced. And quickly." Mrs. Bantry opened her mouth as if to protest, then stopped. Her eyes darted to the window. "Between you and me, dear, there was talk once, years ago, of an understanding between Edwin Carter and Alice Langtry, before she married that dreadful man of hers. He drank, you know, terribly, died young, poor soul." "Yes," Miss Marple said, her knitting needles stilling. "I've seen his grave." Mrs. Bantry hesitated, lowering her voice. "There's more. Someone saw Edwin at the Swan 2 nights before the fete, with a young woman, not local, pretty, dark-haired, and very self-assured. Some say she called him uncle. Others, Edwin. No one can quite agree." "How intriguing," Miss Marple murmured. "A visitor from elsewhere always makes things so much more interesting, doesn't she?" By afternoon, Inspector Craden was making his rounds again. Miss Marple saw him from her window, hat tilted, coat buttoned tight against the damp. He stopped briefly at the vicarage, then at the Langtry house, where he stayed longer than courtesy required. When he finally arrived at Miss Marple's door, his expression was thoughtful but uneasy. "Miss Marple," he said, stepping in. "I wonder if I might trouble you again. Something's come up." "Of course, Inspector." "Do sit down. You look as though the village has given you a headache." He gave a short laugh. "You could say that. Dr. Haydock confirms the poison. Cyanide, as Mrs. Bantry's grapevine predicted. Traces on the cup, faint traces on his fingers. And this morning we discovered something else in his room at the Swan." He pulled from his pocket a small folded envelope. Inside was a pressed violet, delicate and dry, and beneath it a slip of paper in the same elegant handwriting as the letter. I never stopped thinking of that day in the orchard. Miss Marple's brow furrowed. The orchard? How sentimental. Was there such a place here? "There is," Craden said. "Behind the Langtry property, though it hasn't been used in years. Overgrown now. The locals say it's where Mr. Langtry proposed to his wife." Miss Marple set down her knitting. "How very poetic. A meeting place of beginnings. and perhaps endings. Craden watched her closely. "You think Mrs. Langtry's involved?" "I think," she said slowly, "that Edwin Carter came back not only for business, but for something left undone. People rarely return to their first love without reason. Sometimes to rekindle affection, sometimes to settle guilt. Either way, they stir up ghosts better left resting." He nodded grimly. "We'll search the orchard tomorrow." Miss Marple gave a small nod of approval, though her eyes were distant. "Yes, do that. And while you're there, Inspector, do look carefully at the ground beneath the old apple tree. I believe you may find the truth has been buried for quite some time." That evening, as twilight deepened and rain tapped softly on her window, Miss Marple sat motionless, her teacup untouched. Somewhere beyond the village, she imagined the old orchard. Wild grass, wet with rain, branches heavy with decay. And in her mind's eye, she could almost see it. Two figures standing beneath those trees, long ago, whispering promises that time had refused to forget. She smiled faintly to herself, a sadness in her eyes. "Love, after all," she murmured, "is the one motive that never goes out of fashion." Morning came grey and chill, the sort of morning that carried secrets in the fog. A faint mist hung over the hedgerows as Inspector Craden and Constable Davis made their way toward the Langtry orchard, their boots damp with dew. The garden gate creaked open reluctantly, as though disapproving of visitors. Beyond it, the orchard stretched in melancholy silence. Rows of gnarled apple trees, their branches twisted like old hands, reaching for something long lost. Miss Marple, of course, was not far behind. She arrived a few minutes later, ostensibly for her morning constitutional, though the look in her eyes suggested she knew precisely what she hoped to find. She greeted the men with her usual gentility, her umbrella tapping softly against the wet path. "Ah, Miss Marple," Craden said, half smiling, half resigned. "You do seem to have an impeccable sense of timing." "Pure coincidence, I assure you," she replied, peering at the ground. "Though one does enjoy a little fresh air, even when it smells faintly of secrets." He shook his head but said nothing. They moved deeper into the orchard, the grass thick with moss. A blackbird startled from the branches, breaking the stillness. Near the far end, beneath a great apple tree whose roots coiled like rope, Craden stopped short. "There," he said, pointing to a patch of disturbed earth. "Someone's been digging." The constable crouched, brushing away damp soil. A small, rusted tin box emerged, the sort used once for tobacco. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a faded photograph, two young people standing side by side beneath that very tree. The man was unmistakable. Edwin Carter, younger but smiling with the same self-assured ease. Beside him stood a young woman with soft features and eyes filled with both pride and uncertainty. Mrs. Langtry. Behind the photograph lay another folded note, its ink blurred with age. "If they ever find out, we'll both be ruined. You must never tell anyone what happened that night." Craden's expression hardened. So they shared a secret after all. Miss Marple took the photograph delicately, her gloved fingers brushing its edges. Yes, though the question is whose secret it truly was. Men like Mr. Carter often mistake affection for ownership, and women like Mrs. Langtry— She paused, gazing at the trees. They learn early that silence can be a kind of survival. Craden studied her. "You think she's protecting someone?" "I think," Miss Marple said quietly, "that guilt is rarely solitary. It tends to ripple outward, touching more than one life at a time." They left the orchard as the fog began to thin, and Miss Marple's thoughts trailed behind them like the scent of wet earth. She walked back toward the lane, her mind knitting fragments together. The letter, the teacup, the photograph, and the nameless young woman who'd been seen at the Swan. There was, she felt, a missing link still out of sight. By mid-afternoon, she found herself standing outside the inn. Mr. Hargreaves, the innkeeper, was polishing the brass rail along the bar when she entered. He looked up, surprised but pleased. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple. Hear about the poor gentleman's room, I suppose? Terrible business." "Terrible indeed," she agreed gently. "I was just wondering, Mr. Hargreaves, whether you might recall anything about a visitor Mr. Carter received before he died. A young lady, dark-haired, perhaps?" The man hesitated, scratching his head. "Oh yes, there was one. Came in 2 nights before the fete. Sat with him in the corner booth. Didn't order much, just tea, I think. Called him Uncle Edwin. But I remember thinking it sounded forced, like she wasn't used to saying it. Pretty thing, though. Stayed only half an hour. Left him looking mighty troubled." "Did you happen to see where she went?" He frowned. "Out the front door, I believe. But one of the lads said she took the path toward the post office. Might have been visiting someone local." Miss Marple thanked him, leaving a coin on the counter before stepping back into the cool afternoon. The path toward the post office wound past the vicarage and Mrs. Langtry's house. She noticed the curtains there were drawn tight, though a thin wisp of smoke rose from the chimney. As she passed, she caught sight of a figure at the gate. Mrs. Langtry herself, pale and distracted, clutching a letter in her gloved hand. When she saw Miss Marple, she started slightly, then offered a brittle smile. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," she said, voice trembling with forced cheer. "I was just posting something." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the envelope. The handwriting, small, looping, unmistakably feminine, matched the letter found in Edwin Carter's pocket. She smiled kindly. "Ah, correspondence can be so cleansing, can't it? It helps one put things to rest." For a moment, Mrs. Langtry's composure wavered. Yes, I suppose it does." "Do be careful on the road, dear. The stones are quite slick after rain," Miss Marple said softly, before walking on. When she reached the corner, she looked back. Mrs. Langtry still stood by the gate, staring down at the letter as though unsure whether to post it or burn it. That evening, the vicar called by Miss Marple's cottage, ostensibly for tea, but with the kind of troubled expression that always preceded gossip dressed up as moral concern. "My dear Jane," he began, "there's been quite a stir. The inspectors found something else. A ticket stub from the London train in Carter's wallet, dated 2 days before the fete. Do you suppose this all connects somehow?" "Oh, I do indeed," Miss Marple said, pouring him tea. "Only I suspect that journey wasn't one of business, but of blood." The vicar blinked, nearly spilling his cup. "Blood?" She smiled faintly, her tone mild as ever. "Well, dear, sometimes family ties are closer than one expects, and sometimes they tighten around the neck." Outside, the wind stirred the ivy against the window pane. Miss Marple sat back, eyes thoughtful, as a plan began to form in the quiet corners of her mind. The time was coming, she felt, when the truth would need coaxing out, like a frightened bird from a hedge, and she knew just how to do it. The next day dawned clearer, though the air carried that peculiar heaviness that often precedes revelation. The village seemed quieter than usual, as if every soul within St. Mary Mead were holding its breath. Miss Marple, true to her custom, spent the early morning trimming her rose bushes, though her thoughts were far from horticultural. She had slept little. The image of Mrs. Langtry by the gate with that letter had unsettled her, not because of guilt, but because of hesitation. There was something about hesitation that always meant there was more to be found. At 9:30, Inspector Craden arrived once more, his boots already muddied from the orchard path. He looked tired but alert, as though the night had yielded more questions than rest. "We've confirmed something odd, Miss Marple," he began, standing in her doorway. "The handwriting on the note found in Mr. Carter's room, the one about the orchard, matches Mrs. Langtry's. Our expert is sure of it." Miss Marple nodded mildly, though her eyes were sharp. Not so surprising, Inspector. She's never been one to disguise her hand. But tell me, have you found anything about that young woman? The one from the Swan? Craydon exhaled, rubbing his chin. That's the other matter. A ticket from London was purchased under the name Margaret Langtry. Miss Marple looked up, her knitting pausing mid-stitch. Margaret Langtry, she repeated softly. How very interesting. Mrs. Langtry's daughter passed away years ago, so she says. A child lost to fever while visiting her aunt, if I recall the story correctly. The inspector frowned. But if the girl who visited Carter was using that name, then, Miss Marple said gently, either she borrowed it, or she had every right to use it. The inspector's face grew grave. You think Carter's visitor was her daughter? Miss Marple placed her knitting neatly on her lap and folded her hands. It would explain much, wouldn't it? A young woman no one in the village recognizes, a man who returns after decades abroad, and a mother whose past was never quite as tidy as she pretended. Craydon leaned forward. You think Carter was the father? Miss Marple smiled faintly, not with amusement but with quiet inevitability. I think it is often safer to assume the heart is less discreet than the lips. Mrs. Langtry's husband was already known for his temper and his fondness for drink. The secret child would have been quite impossible to explain. Perhaps she sent the girl away. Perhaps Mr. Carter helped arrange it. In any case, such things have a way of resurfacing, especially when the child grows up and starts asking questions. The inspector nodded slowly, as though the weight of the idea settled on him like mist. If that's true, the letter in his pocket, forgive me, might not have been meant for him at all. Precisely, Miss Marple murmured. It may have been meant for someone else entirely. The day wore on in soft, hesitant hours. By mid-afternoon, the postmistress, Miss Greeley, appeared at Miss Marple's door, nervous and fluttering as a small bird. I do hope I'm not disturbing you, Miss Marple, she said breathlessly. Only, well, there's been a strange business at the post office. Mrs. Langtry's letter, the one she posted yesterday, it's come back. Come back? Miss Greeley nodded, handing over the small unopened envelope. Returned this morning. No address, you see. Just to my daughter, and nothing more. I didn't know what to do with it, so I thought perhaps you might. Miss Marple accepted it quietly, running her fingers over the paper. The handwriting was unmistakable. Steady, deliberate, filled with sorrow. Thank you, Miss Greeley. You've been most helpful. When the woman had gone, Miss Marple sat by the window, watching the sunlight fade through the lace curtains. She turned the envelope over once, then twice, before opening it with slow precision. Inside was a single page, written in the same delicate script. My dearest child, if you ever find this, know that I loved you. I did what I thought was right, though it cost me more than I can say. He came back because he wished to tell you himself. I was afraid you would hate me. I could not bear to see you both. The letter trembled slightly in her hand. Miss Marple closed it and stared into the hearth for a long moment, her face unreadable. Then she rose, put on her hat and gloves, and set out toward the Langtry house. The windows were still shuttered, and the air carried the faint scent of lilac and decay. When Mrs. Langtry answered the door, she looked as though she hadn't slept. Her face was drawn, her eyes hollowed by sleepless guilt. Miss Marple, she whispered, her voice brittle. I suppose you've come to accuse me. Accuse you? Miss Marple repeated kindly. Oh no, dear, only to tell you that love rarely dies quietly, and secrets even less so. She held out the letter. This came back to the post office this morning. Mrs. Langtry's eyes widened, then filled with tears. She took the letter, but didn't open it. I thought if I sent it away, it would end, she said softly, that none of it would matter anymore. Things rarely end that easily, Miss Marple replied. Not when they begin in pain. Mrs. Langtry sank into the nearest chair, the strength leaving her. She came here, you know. Margaret. She came asking about him. I told her nothing. I couldn't. She was so angry. Said he had written to her. Asked to meet at the fete. I begged her not to go. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but steady. But she did go. Mrs. Langtry nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks. I saw them talking behind the tea tent. He was trying to tell her the truth. Then she ran off. I didn't follow. I couldn't bear it. Miss Marple's eyes rested on her quietly. And when did you see him next? Later, just before it happened. He came to me, asking for forgiveness. I told him it was too late. Then I went home, that's all. Miss Marple regarded her for a long moment. No, my dear, she said softly. That isn't quite all. You see, someone slipped poison into his cup, and I think you know who. Mrs. Langtry froze. Her hands clenched the letter tightly, crumpling it. Miss Marple leaned closer, her tone low but almost compassionate. It wasn't you, of course. You wouldn't have had time, and besides, guilt doesn't always kill, but a daughter's fury, when fed by betrayal, that can be far more fatal. The clock on the mantel ticked faintly. Mrs. Langtry's shoulders began to shake, and when she finally spoke, her voice was scarcely a whisper. She only meant to frighten him. I know, Miss Marple said quietly, rising, but fear, once loosed, rarely knows when to stop. Outside, the air had turned cool again, and the first drops of evening rain began to fall. Miss Marple pulled her shawl tighter, her steps slow but certain. The truth, she knew, was nearly all in view now. But as always, before the end, came one last test, a gentle nudge to reveal what guilt alone would not. That evening, the village seemed caught between silence and anticipation. The lamps flickered dimly through drawn curtains, and even the sound of footsteps along the cobblestones carried a kind of hesitation. Miss Marple, seated once more by her parlour fire, allowed her knitting to rest in her lap. She was waiting, not for proof, but for confirmation. The pieces were nearly all in place, yet the final move would need a gentle push. Shortly before 8, there came another knock at her door. It was Inspector Craden, looking as though the day had been long and fruitless. "We've traced the girl," he said without preamble. "Margaret Langtry. She was staying at a boarding house in Market Down. Left yesterday morning and hasn't been seen since. Took a small valise with her, that's all." Miss Marple nodded, unsurprised. A sensible child, really. When one's entire life begins to crumble, distance seems the only refuge. Craden's brow furrowed. "You think she killed him, don't you? Out of anger or revenge?" "I think," Miss Marple said slowly, "that she believed herself betrayed. Not once, but twice. A man she thought her father lied to her, and a woman she thought her mother refused to claim her. Such feelings can drive a young heart to rashness." She leaned forward slightly. "But she didn't plan to kill him. She only brought the poison to frighten him, to make him confess. You'll find she bought it in London under false pretenses. Rat poison, perhaps. I shouldn't be surprised if she left the remainder behind at her lodging." Craden exhaled, rubbing his temples. "You make it sound almost inevitable." Miss Marple gave a small, wistful smile. "In matters of the heart, Inspector, inevitability is often just another name for folly." There was a pause. Then she added, "If I were you, I'd send word to the station master at Market Down. Ask if any young woman boarded a late train toward London last night. She won't have gone for. Guilt doesn't travel easily. It weighs the suitcase down." Craden nodded, already reaching for his notebook. "You're sure?" "Quite sure," she replied. "But when you do find her, be kind. She's not dangerous anymore, only lost." After he had gone, Miss Marple remained by the fire long into the night. The rain began again, soft at first, then heavier, washing the streets clean of dust but not of memory. She thought of Mrs. Langtry, alone in her dark house with that letter, and of the orchard where love had once bloomed and rotted in equal measure. The sins of youth, she reflected, were like the roots of old trees. They twisted underground, unseen, until one day they surfaced. Near midnight, a soft knock came again. When she opened the door, she found Mrs. Langtry standing there, drenched and trembling, her shawl clinging to her shoulders. In her hand was a small envelope. "She's written to me," she said, voice breaking. "Margaret, the letter came just now. The postmistress brought it herself." Miss Marple took her gently by the arm and led her inside. The older woman's hands shook as she unfolded the paper. "Mother, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for him to die. I only wanted him to tell me the truth. I thought he'd laugh at me again, so I poured it in when he wasn't looking. Just a few drops. He drank, and I ran. I didn't know it would kill so quickly. Please forgive me. I'm going away. I don't belong to either of you now." Mrs. Langtry pressed the letter to her chest, sobbing quietly. "She's gone," she whispered. "My child. My only child." Miss Marple watched her for a moment before speaking. "Perhaps not gone, my dear. Only trying to make sense of something that never had sense to begin with. She'll be found, and she'll face what she's done. But that, in its strange way, may be the beginning of forgiveness." Mrs. Langtry looked up, her eyes red and pleading. "Do you believe that?" Miss Marple's gaze softened. "Oh, yes. I've seen it before. Love, even when misused, has a curious habit of surviving its own disasters." By morning, word came from the market down Constabulary. A young woman matching Margaret Langtry's description had been found at the small guest house near the station. She'd confessed quietly, almost with relief. "The poison," she said, "had been meant as punishment, not as death. When she saw him fall, she fled, terrified of what she had done." Inspector Creighton stopped by later that day to relay the news. "You were right about everything," he said. "She'll be remanded to London for trial, but I dare say the magistrate will see she wasn't wicked, just desperate." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Desperation often makes a better murderer than malice. Still, I do hope they'll be gentle with her. She's suffered more than she knows." When the inspector had gone, Miss Marple wandered out into her garden. The roses glistened with dew, and the air carried a faint sweetness that belied the darkness of recent days. Somewhere in the distance, the church bells began to chime, low and solemn. She paused by the gate, gazing toward the Langtry house, its curtains still drawn, its silence unbroken. Then, softly to herself, she murmured, "In the end, it wasn't the poison that killed him, it was the past, and no one in St. Mary Mead, I think, will ever quite forget that." She turned back toward her cottage, the faintest sigh escaping her lips as she resumed her knitting, her needles clicking softly in rhythm with the ticking of the clock. Steady, patient, and untroubled. For Miss Marple knew that while crimes came and went, human nature, in all its frailty and folly, would always remain the same. The days that followed were strangely still, as if the village itself were reluctant to disturb what had finally settled. The police car had come and gone, taking with it the girl who bore her mother's eyes, but none of her composure. The newspapers, of course, made the most of it. "Murder at a village fete," read the headline in the Daily Chronicle, and for a time, St. Mary Mead was famous for all the wrong reasons, but fame, like scandal, never lingered long in such a place. By the end of the week, the chatter had softened into sighs, and life crept back toward its ordinary rhythm. Miss Marple, however, felt no peace in it. There was something unfinished, a quiet unease that tugged at the edge of her mind. She sat one evening by her window as twilight deepened, her knitting idle, her eyes unfocused. It was not that she doubted Margaret Langtry's confession. No, the girl had spoken the truth as she believed it. But there was another truth, quieter and colder, hiding behind her words. The kind of truth that doesn't shout but lingers, like the scent of something burned. The following morning brought a small but telling incident. The postmistress, Miss Greeley, stopped by with a hesitant expression and a small bundle of envelopes. "I thought you ought to see this, Miss Marple," she said, lowering her voice. "It's that poor Mr. Carter's mail, forwarded from London after his death. The inspector said it might be nothing, but one of these letters caught my eye." Miss Marple thanked her and examined the envelopes. Most were businesslike, thin paper, typed addresses, but one stood out. The handwriting was elegant, refined, and unfamiliar. The postmark read, Paris. She turned it over. The flap had already been slit open, though neatly resealed. Inside, the letter was brief. "My dear Edwin, it was kind of you to write. I cannot say I was surprised to hear she had returned to England. Time always finds its way back to old wounds. I did what you asked. She will not trouble you again. Please destroy my letters as promised. Some things are best left buried. Yours, as ever, C." Miss Marple read it twice, her expression unchanging. "How curious," she murmured softly. "A woman in Paris, and one who knew far too much." She folded the letter and slipped it back into its envelope. Later that afternoon, she paid a call to the vicarage, where Inspector Craydon was having tea with the vicar and his wife. They looked surprised, but not displeased to see her. "Miss Marple," the inspector said, rising, "I was just saying to the vicar that I owe you a debt of gratitude. Without your guidance, we might never have pieced it together." Miss Marple smiled modestly. "Oh, I do so enjoy when justice takes its proper course. Though," she added lightly, "sometimes it takes a winding path to get there." She laid the Paris letter gently on the table. Craydon's brow furrowed as he read it. "You think this is connected?" "Oh, I should say so," she replied calmly. "The tone is familiar, too assured, too proprietary. I dare say our Mr. Carter was a man of many correspondences, but this one seems to suggest an accomplice, or at least someone with a vested interest in silencing the past." The inspector's eyes narrowed. "You think Mrs. Langtry wasn't the only woman involved?" "Indeed," Miss Marple said. "Mr. Carter spent years abroad. It's quite possible he married, or promised marriage, to someone else. If he returned to England intending to make amends, that could have jeopardized her position, perhaps even her fortune. A jealous woman in Paris, a frightened daughter in St. Mary Mead, and a man who thought he could manage both. It has a tragic symmetry, doesn't it?" The vicar's wife gasped softly. "You don't mean the poison came from abroad?" "Not the poison, perhaps," Miss Marple said, "but the idea of it. There's a kind of cruelty that doesn't need distance. It only needs opportunity." Craydon leaned back, studying her. "But Carter's death. Margaret confessed to that." "Yes," Miss Marple said quietly, "and I don't doubt she believes she did it. But you'll find, if you test the cup again, that the dose was far too strong to have been administered by an unsteady hand. It was measured, calculated. Someone knew what they were doing. The girl merely acted the fool's part in a play written long before she arrived." The inspector stared at her, the color draining slightly from his face. "You mean he was already dying before she poured the tea?" Miss Marple inclined her head. "Precisely. A second dose made sure of it, but the first was already at work. Whoever sent that letter from Paris had reason to make certain he never spoke again. And yet somehow she knew Margaret had come to England. Someone must have written to her." The vicar's wife clasped her hands. "But who could have?" Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the window, where the church spire rose pale against the evening sky. "Mrs. Langtry, perhaps. Or perhaps she wasn't as alone in her grief as she wished us to think." Craydon stood, restless now. "I'll send for records of Carter's London correspondence and his bank transfers. If he was supporting anyone abroad, it should show. Miss Marple nodded approvingly. Do that, Inspector, but do it quietly. There's no sense stirring the ashes until you're certain which way the wind is blowing. When she returned home that evening, the first stars were faint above the rooftops. The village seemed peaceful once more, but Miss Marple knew better. Peace, in her experience, was simply what people called the silence that follows a lie. She placed the Paris letter on her writing desk, beside a small vase of wilting roses, and sat looking at it for a long while. At last, she whispered to herself, a letter that should have been destroyed, a love that refused to die, and a crime committed not out of hate, but out of fear. Oh yes, there's more to come yet. And as the clock in the hall struck 9, Miss Marple began to write a letter of her own, this one addressed very deliberately to the Inspector of Police in Paris. The reply from Paris arrived 5 days later, delivered by the postmistress herself, who hovered in Miss Marple's doorway with the faint excitement of someone entrusted with a secret. "Special courier, Miss Marple," she said, lowering her voice as if the letter itself might overhear. "From the French police, no less." Miss Marple thanked her, waited until the door had closed behind her, and then broke the seal with a practiced calm. The letter, written in formal English, was brief and precise, an official report, yet tinged with the faint curiosity of those unaccustomed to the peculiar intersections of love and crime that seemed to follow her village. Regarding your inquiry into one C, the correspondent of Mr. Edwin Carter, it read, our records confirm that a Miss Celeste Fournier, age 48, formerly of the British colony in Rhodesia, has been residing in Paris under her maiden name. She was married briefly to a Mr. Edwin Carter during his stay in Africa, though the union was never legally dissolved. The lady is known to maintain a discreet circle of acquaintances and has been recently under the observation of our department due to her connection to a smuggling inquiry involving chemical substances. Miss Marple set the letter down, her eyes narrowing slightly. Chemical substances, she murmured. How very convenient. That evening, Inspector Craden came by once more, summoned by one of her delicate but unmistakable notes. He arrived just after dusk, his expression a mixture of fatigue and anticipation. "You've something new," he said as soon as he crossed the threshold. "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, handing him the Paris letter. "It seems Mr. Carter's past was rather more entangled than we imagined. He wasn't merely visiting Mrs. Langtry out of sentiment. He had another wife, a woman who, I suspect, realized that the truth of that marriage would not only disgrace her, but cost her financially." Craden scanned the document, his lips tightening. "You think this Celeste Fournier sent the poison?" "I think she sent something far subtler," Miss Marple said. "A bottle, perhaps, labeled as a tonic, or a gift of medicine under the pretext of kindness. Mr. Carter would have trusted her handwriting. He'd have drunk it without question. The girl's careless act with the tea only finished what was already begun." The inspector looked thoughtful, then grim. "So Margaret didn't kill him after all?" "Oh, I wouldn't say that," Miss Marple replied gently. "She delivered the final blow, even if she didn't know she was doing it. Guilt will make her punishment far greater than any court's." He sighed, resting his hat on the table. "And the mother? Mrs. Langtry?" "She'll live quietly," Miss Marple said almost tenderly. "Perhaps too quietly. Grief of that kind doesn't fade. It calcifies. But she'll survive. Women always do, Inspector, when they've spent a lifetime pretending to be strong." He gave a faint smile. "You've a rather poetic way of putting things, Miss Marple." She smiled back, her eyes twinkling with their usual mild mischief. Poetry, like murder, is only the arrangement of truth in its most revealing order. For a moment they sat in companionable silence, the fire crackling softly between them. Then Miss Marple rose and crossed to her small writing desk, retrieving another envelope, this one unopened. She handed it to him. "This arrived yesterday, postmarked Paris again. Addressed to Mr. Carter. I thought it better you open it. Craden slit the envelope carefully. Inside was a single page, the handwriting identical to the earlier letter. Dearest, I trust you've dealt with your affairs in England as agreed. Do not attempt to reach me again. What we shared has become a liability. You should never have written to that woman. You know how I detest loose ends. Craden stared at the words. So she knew about Mrs. Langtry and the daughter. Oh, yes, Miss Marple said softly. Jealousy is an excellent observer. But she underestimated one thing, the tendency of truth to drift upward no matter how deeply one buries it. I dare say your Paris colleagues will find traces of the same compound in her possession. The inspector folded the letter carefully, pocketing it. We'll send for her. This should settle it. Miss Marple nodded approvingly. I imagine so, though I rather think the lady won't make it easy for you. People like that rarely do. They prefer to die with their illusions intact. 2 weeks later, the telegram arrived from France. Celeste Fournier found deceased in her flat, apparent suicide, vial of potassium cyanide recovered. Miss Marple read it without surprise. She set the telegram on the mantel beside the Paris letter, her face illuminated by the faint firelight. Outside, the evening rain began again, steady and unhurried. When Inspector Craden came by the next morning, he found her in her garden, pruning roses with her usual calm. You've heard, I suppose? He asked quietly. I have, she said, snipping a withered bloom. A tragic ending, though not unexpected. Some women would rather write their own conclusion than be written by others. He nodded, silent for a moment. Well, the case is closed now. Miss Marple gave a soft hum, neither agreement nor denial. Yes, she said at last. The case, perhaps. But not the story. In truth, it never really ends. It only changes hands. Craden frowned faintly. You mean Mrs. Langtry? Miss Marple looked up, meeting his gaze. Her and the daughter and every woman who's ever loved a man who couldn't choose between honesty and charm. St. Mary Mead will tidy itself soon enough. But some ghosts, Inspector, never quite leave the garden. As he departed, Miss Marple turned back to her roses, trimming away the dead leaves with steady care. The sky above the village was pale and clear now, washed clean by the rain. Yet somewhere beneath that calm, the faint scent of lilac lingered still, a memory of the fete, the laughter, and the single unforgivable secret that had begun it all. She straightened, brushed a stray petal from her glove, and whispered to herself, with a trace of melancholy amusement, love again, always love. One might almost call it the most respectable motive for murder there is. The following weeks passed quietly, though in St. Mary Mead, quiet never meant the absence of talk. The story of Edwin Carter's death had already been folded neatly into the village's tapestry of memory, embroidered upon, softened and altered in a dozen retellings. Some swore Mrs. Langtry had gone mad from grief. Others claimed Miss Marple had single-handedly outwitted Scotland Yard. Only Miss Marple herself seemed untouched by it all, moving about her days with her usual serenity, tending her garden and listening, always listening to the hum beneath ordinary words. Yet something about the affair refused to settle entirely. One afternoon, as she sat in the garden with her tea cooling beside her, she found herself revisiting the smallest of details, the sealed envelope she had handed to Inspector Craden weeks ago. It had been addressed to Carter, yes, but something about the handwriting still troubled her. She had seen it once before, in an unexpected place. It wasn't Celeste Fournier's elegant scrawl, nor Mrs. Langtry's trembling hand. It had been more deliberate, less emotional, someone trying to imitate another's style. And that, Miss Marple reflected, was never done without purpose. She set her cup down and rose slowly, brushing the soil from her gloves. Her path took her past the churchyard, where Mrs. Langtry now spent her mornings placing fresh flowers on the newly tended grave. The woman looked thinner, her movements quieter, as though she had folded herself in half to carry her sorrow. "Such a lovely arrangement," Miss Marple said softly, pausing beside her. Mrs. Langtry glanced up, startled, then managed a wan smile. "He liked lilacs," she murmured. "I thought it only fitting." "They do have a certain forgiveness about them," Miss Marple replied. "Though forgiveness, I find, is often easier given to the dead than the living." Mrs. Langtry's eyes flickered. "There are things one can't forgive, Miss Marple, not even in oneself." "I dare say that's true," Miss Marple said gently. "But perhaps there are also things one can't quite bury, even when one thinks one has." The woman looked away quickly, her fingers tightening around the stems. "I don't know what you mean." "Oh, nothing in particular," Miss Marple said, her tone airy. "Only that I was thinking about handwriting. Such a revealing habit, isn't it? So intimate. People can change their names, their clothes, even their stories, but the way they form their letters always gives them away." There was the faintest pause before Mrs. Langtry spoke again, her voice a fraction too calm. "I wouldn't know. I've never been much of a letter writer." Miss Marple smiled, that gentle, disarming smile that seemed to see through time itself. "Oh, but you were once, my dear. You wrote to him often, long ago, and again, I think, quite recently." For a moment, neither woman spoke. The sound of the breeze through the yews filled the silence. Then Mrs. Langtry stood abruptly, brushing the dirt from her skirt. "You're mistaken," she said quietly. "I've nothing left to write about." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, "or perhaps you simply wanted to finish the story your daughter started. A mother's instinct, after all, can be so protective, even when it means rewriting the truth." Mrs. Langtry froze, her eyes widening slightly. Then, slowly, she sank back down onto the bench beside the grave. "You always know, don't you?" she whispered. Miss Marple said nothing. She simply waited. "I couldn't bear it," Mrs. Langtry went on, her voice trembling now, "when I learned what she'd done. When I saw her face that night, she was terrified. I knew they'd take her away, ruin her life before it had even begun. He'd already poisoned enough of it." She pressed her hand to her mouth, fighting to steady her breath. "So I wrote the letter, to Paris, pretended to be him. I thought, if she came back, if the woman in France still hated him, perhaps fate would do what I could not." Her confession came out like a sigh, escaping years of silence. "When the news came that she'd done it herself, I knew then what I'd done. I'd set it all in motion. My daughter's guilt, that woman's death. All of it. My hand may never have touched the cup, but I was the one who poured it, wasn't I?" Miss Marple's expression softened, though her eyes remained clear and unyielding. "Guilt has many hands, my dear, but it's conscience that keeps them trembling afterward. You did what frightened people do. You tried to protect what was left of love. Only love, as I've often said, rarely thanks us for such kindness." Mrs. Langtry let out a broken sound, part sob, part laughter. "Do you mean to tell the inspector?" Miss Marple looked toward the grave, the lilacs trembling faintly in the breeze. "No," she said quietly. "The truth is already buried here, I think. And the living, well, they'll find their own punishment without our help." Mrs. Langtry's shoulders shook once, and then she bowed her head. Miss Marple touched her arm gently, a gesture so small it might have been mistaken for comfort or farewell. As she walked back through the lane toward her cottage, the sky began to pale with the promise of rain. Behind her, the church bell chimed the hour, solemn and echoing through the stillness. Miss Marple paused at her gate, looking back once toward the churchyard. "Poor woman," she murmured softly. She thought she'd buried her first love twice, once in youth and once in guilt. But one can never quite bury the heart. It always finds its way back to the surface. She stepped inside, closing the gate behind her. The kettle began to whistle faintly. The roses trembled with the first drops of rain, and inside the small, tidy cottage of St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat once more at her table, quiet, composed, and very nearly at peace. Only her eyes, bright as ever, betrayed the knowledge that peace in the village was never more than temporary. Somewhere, someone would love unwisely again, and when they did, she would be ready. The rain that followed that afternoon fell softly at first, but by evening it had turned steady and cold, threading down the windows like thin silver veins. Inside her cottage, Miss Marple sat in her armchair, the fire flickering low. She had not lit the lamp yet. The dim light suited her thoughts that moved as quietly and deliberately as the raindrops outside. She was not troubled exactly, but there was a weight in her chest, the familiar ache that came when justice and mercy had crossed paths and left neither wholly victorious. A light tap at her door broke her reverie. It was Inspector Craden again, his hat dripping with rain. He looked pale and unsettled. "Forgive me for calling so late, Miss Marple," he said as she ushered him in, "but there's something I think you ought to know." She motioned him toward the fire. "You're quite soaked, Inspector. Sit and I'll pour you some tea. You look as though you've seen a ghost." He gave a humorless smile. "Not a ghost, a confession." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, handing him the cup. "Ah, Mrs. Langtry." He blinked in surprise. "So you knew." "I suspected she might relieve her conscience before long," Miss Marple said gently. "A woman like that. One can only bear silence for so long." Craden nodded slowly. "She came to the station this afternoon. Said she'd written the Paris letters herself. Admitted she meant to frighten Mr. Carter. To ruin him, perhaps, but not to kill him. Still, her message seems to have driven that French woman to suicide." Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. "Driven, yes, but not by force. Only by memory. There's a difference, Inspector." "She was in tears," Craden continued quietly. "Kept saying she'd destroyed everyone she loved. I wanted to comfort her, but there's only so much one can say when a person sees her guilt as justice." Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her voice remained steady. "You mustn't be too hard on her. She spent her life mistaking self-preservation for righteousness. It's a very common confusion, especially among those who love deeply and unwisely." Craden looked into the fire. "We've decided not to charge her. There's no direct evidence, and it would serve no purpose. Margaret's still in custody, but with the new findings, her sentence will likely be suspended. She'll go abroad, I expect." Miss Marple nodded. "Perhaps to begin again. The young are surprisingly resilient, you know. They break, but they also heal in ways the old no longer can." The inspector exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly. "You always manage to make sense of things, even when they shouldn't make sense at all." She smiled faintly. "That's only because I've seen enough of human nature to know it rarely changes, only rearranges itself into different tragedies." For a while, neither spoke. The fire hissed softly, and the room filled with the scent of wet wool and tea leaves. Outside, thunder rolled distantly over the hills. Finally, Craden stood, setting his empty cup on the table. "Well, I suppose that's the end of it. I only wish we'd met under more cheerful circumstances." Miss Marple rose with him, her eyes glinting kindly. "Oh, my dear Inspector, in St. Mary Mead, cheerful circumstances are usually just the quiet before the next storm." He laughed softly. "Heaven forbid." After he left, Miss Marple remained standing by the window, watching as his lantern light disappeared into the mist. The village was nearly invisible in the rain, its cottages tucked beneath a veil of fog and memory. Somewhere in the distance, she could just make out the faint toll of the church bell. Slow, deliberate, mournful. She turned back toward the mantel, where the Paris letter still lay folded beside the dying fire. For a long moment she regarded it in silence. Then she picked it up, held it over the flames, and watched as the edges curled and blackened. The paper crumbled soundlessly, the ink dissolving into smoke. When it was gone, she whispered, "Let the dead keep their secrets. The living have enough of their own." She settled once more into her chair, the firelight flickering across her calm, lined face. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily. Outside, the rain softened to a whisper, the kind that always seemed to cleanse without quite erasing, and in that small, quiet cottage, with its tea things and its roses pressed against the window pane, Miss Marple closed her eyes, not in triumph nor in sorrow, but in understanding. Because in her long experience, every village, no matter how peaceful, carried its own small sins, its loves turned bitter, and its secrets buried just shallow enough for truth to bloom again. And when it did, as it surely would, she would be there, needle in hand, eyes bright, waiting patiently for the next tangled thread to reveal itself. The following morning dawned crisp and pale, the air washed clean after the long rain. Miss Marple's garden glistened with dew, each rose bending slightly under the weight of it, as though bowing in quiet reflection. The village, too, seemed to breathe easier, as if a long, unspoken tension had at last released its hold. But peace, Miss Marple knew, was a deceptive thing. It arrived like sunlight through lace, delicate, fractured, and never entirely complete. She had not intended to leave her cottage that morning, but as she took her tea by the window, she noticed Mrs. Langtry crossing the lane, walking slowly toward the churchyard. The woman's posture was different, no longer defensive nor desperate, but resigned. She carried no flowers this time, only a single white envelope, folded once, held tight in her hands. By the time Miss Marple reached the churchyard, Mrs. Langtry was standing beside Edwin Carter's grave. She didn't look up when she spoke. "It's strange, isn't it, how one's heart can hold both love and hatred for the same person?" "It's quite common," Miss Marple replied softly. "We call it conscience when we're older, but it feels the same either way." Mrs. Langtry smiled faintly, the gesture trembling on her lips. "I've written to Margaret, told her everything, the truth about him and about me. I don't expect her to forgive me, but perhaps one day she'll understand. I can't undo what I've done, but I can stop hiding behind it." Miss Marple nodded approvingly. "That's a brave thing, my dear. Truth once spoken often loses its power to wound." Mrs. Langtry turned to her, her eyes glistening. "Do you ever tire of it, Miss Marple, of knowing what people are capable of?" "Oh, constantly," Miss Marple said with a small laugh. "But one must garden with the soil one's given. Evil grows best in ignorance, and someone must tend the weeds." For a moment, the two women stood together in the silence that only honesty brings, the kind that feels both heavy and freeing. Then Mrs. Langtry placed the letter upon the grave, resting her hand over it briefly before stepping back. "He ruined so many lives," she whispered. "And yet it's mine I regret the most." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "He ruined only what others let him touch. You can't destroy a soul that refuses to surrender." Mrs. Langtry looked at her with quiet gratitude, then turned and walked slowly away, her figure fading between the hedgerows until the morning mist swallowed her entirely. Miss Marple lingered. She knelt briefly beside the grave, adjusting the lilacs that had begun to wilt. As she straightened them, something pale caught her eye. An edge of paper, half buried near the stone. She lifted it delicately. It was a torn scrap of the letter Mrs. Langtry had placed there, the ink running slightly from the damp. Just enough remained to read the final line. "If love is a sin, then I have sinned gladly, for it made me human." Miss Marple folded the fragment and tucked it gently into her sleeve. Then she rose and looked out over the village. The church bell tolled once, soft, solitary, and she smiled faintly to herself. Later that day, when Inspector Craden returned for one final courtesy call, he found her in her garden, pruning with her usual unhurried grace. "I thought I should tell you," he said. Mrs. Langtry has left the village. She's gone north to stay with a cousin. The daughter's been released, sailing for Canada next week. I'd say the whole matter's finished." Miss Marple wiped her pruning shears on a cloth, her eyes bright with that familiar knowing light. "Finished," she repeated gently. "Yes, perhaps in the way all such stories finish. The guilty punished, the innocent freed. But everyone changed, Inspector. Always changed." He smiled, tipping his hat. "You're a remarkable woman, Miss Marple. I only hope the next case I draw is half as tidy as this one." She chuckled softly. "Oh, my dear man, you'll find no tidy cases where people are involved. Only the illusion of tidiness, like a bed that's been hastily made." As he departed down the lane, Miss Marple returned to her roses. The sun had emerged fully now, casting a warm, forgiving glow across the village. The world, as it often did, appeared peaceful again, at least for the moment. She paused, clipping one perfect bloom and holding it thoughtfully in her hand. The petals were a soft blush pink, opening delicately from the center, untouched by the rain. "Love and guilt," she murmured, smiling to herself. "The two most faithful companions of human nature. One begins it, and the other ends it." And with that, she carried the rose inside, placed it in a small vase beside the window, and settled once more into her chair. Outside, the village clock chimed noon. Life went on, as it always had, and Miss Marple, with her quiet eyes and her untiring curiosity, watched it unfold, ready, should it ever be required, to see through the next illusion of innocence that dared to bloom in St. Mary Mead. The end.